welcome to Chatting with Interesting People. I'm Steve, and today I've got, well, I was going to say an old friend. He's been a friend for a long time. This is Jon. Welcome, Jon.
Hi there. I am flattered to be deemed an interesting person.
And not old.
And not old.
You were probably one of the first people I met when I moved to London, I think, back in 2003 now.
Yes, in the clubhouse. Was it the clubhouse?
Yes. So I moved there to do kind of the youth work, and your office was based down next to it. And then within the first day or two of me arriving, I got shown around. So I got to meet all different people there. And I think we started off by going through to your office and then elsewhere in the building.
Yeah. Did we chat a lot at work, or was it in the pub after church?
I don't think we chatted kind of very much on the first day, but over time we did. Because the office was right next to mine. If we start there then, so I was there doing youth work, and what were you doing?
In 2003.
Yeah, so that was central London in a community centre.
Yes, I was working for a mission organisation with a focus on the workplace. So I had been spending a lot of time running evangelism training with Christian groups in their workplaces. So 2003, I'm just going to, off the top of my head, probably Marks and Spencer, Abbey National, as Santander was then, possibly Schroders, Barclays Global Investors, who later became BlackRock. So I think it was that era. And when I wasn't doing that, I was meeting up with guys and reading the Bible with them from cover to cover.
That's amazing. It was very sociable kind of thing, wasn't it? And I think that's what led us to kind of talking a lot. And we were both in the area doing a lot of work with people. So
yeah, I remember one of the things we used to do as an organization was people skills in the workplace. So I took a bunch of notes from my then boss about listening and asserting, and I themed them around forgiveness. So all these people skills were about forgiveness. And I remember I used to listen to the youth workers at the clubhouse, you or the people that came after you, and I used to borrow examples of your people skills, because you went on to become a security guard.
I did,
which is the same set of skills as working with youth. So I was sitting in my office overhearing all this stuff, making notes for my courses.
Yeah, and some of my security work, actually most of my security work, was very much focused on the people skills. And ideally you don't want to get physical and hands-on, so talking people down and things, it makes a lot of difference.
When did you go on to Kensington?
So I was at the clubhouse for 2 years. So 2005 I moved on, and I started working at the council in 2007.
Wasn't that security?
Yes. So
you got me a gig there. I did the evangelism training. I did a short abbreviated standalone session.
With the
Christian group at the council.
Yeah. So I'd done security kind of in a lot of concerts and events and things, and then I did a year at Selfridges. So that was incredibly high-end customer service.
Yeah.
And then took those kind of skills to the council, and I was there for almost 7 years.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yes, 2014. Wow.
Yeah. So let's go back from there now. So we know, when we met, whereabouts did you grow up, and tell me a bit about that.
I'm still growing up. I was born in Leamington Spa, Where everyone thinks that's really posh, and it might be nowadays, but I'm sure it wasn't as gentrified in the early 70s.
Yeah,
So
that's kind of the Midlands, isn't it?
it's the Midlands. I grew up in a village outside of Warwick for 5 years, 4 years, 5 years. And then we moved into Leamington itself for primary school. So I lived in Leamington for 14 years, following the first 4 in a village. And then the rest of my time in London. So I've lived most of my life in London, but the first 18 in the Midlands.
So what took you to London?
University. My school had never, ever sent somebody to study theology. And so the only person who had any idea what was required or what was a good place to study was the school chaplain. And he said, if you're an extrovert, go to London. And if you're an introvert, go to Durham. And that made it easy. I ended up in London. He said, if you go to London, you'll have a lot of friends. And if you go to Durham, you will have a few, albeit quality friends. So here I am.
Yeah, and as far as I could tell, you moved to London and got a lot of quality friends.
Yes, yes. It could be an echo chamber, like you say your quality and I say your quality, but we don't have any point of reference. No, I really do. I really do value the relationships. So I'm still working in the non-profit sector. Therefore, I have no money, but I am rich in relationships.
Okay, so what? After the work in the clubhouse, and what did you do after that? And how did you get to where you are now?
I set up a charity to do the same work I used to do for my former employer, and the advantage of it being a smaller charity is that I can really focus on local needs, whether that's in the workplace or the community. So that process started in 2014. And while we were setting up, I went back to my first job, or my first sector, my first area of expertise, which was marketing. So I did that after I graduated for 3 years. I came back to it after a good number of years in mission. And the world had changed. We didn't use fax machines. We used social media, but all the principles are the same. So I did 4 part-time jobs while we set up the charity. I worked for the Jet Lag Bar on Cleveland Street, the best bar in London it was. I did their marketing.
Amazing sports bar, isn't it?
Yes, it's gone now, but that's a whole nother story. Yeah. And then I worked on Harley Street for a baby clinic. I worked in the city for a company that will look after your money if your net worth is several £million. And I worked for a friend in property. So I just did a number of things while we got the green light from the Charity Commission.
Okay, and so is that charity what you're doing now?
It is. The charity is called Bread of Hope. We like to provide spiritual food. We help people in the workplace approach their work as worship, forgive others as God forgives them, and to witness to those around them. And then we like to supply physical food. So up until the pandemic, I was supplying the local food bank. Then because I was shielding, I couldn't do that. And also the food bank transitioned from supplying physical food to making financial donations. And that didn't fit well with our ethos. As a charity, Bread of Hope wants to put people before programs. So that means we really like to sit down with people and get to know them. There's something about inefficiency. when you put people before efficiency, it can be a good thing. We wanted, this was the dream, that rather than have me doing all this work in the city, the West End, Canary Wharf government with Christians, we wanted to make sure that I was still anchored in our community. And that's where the food bank was helpful. But by anchoring, I mean getting to know my neighbors, getting to know the people who are struggling to make ends meet. So I'm more than just a guy who gives them food. I actually get to know people. And that was beginning to happen. I was seeing people on the bus, in the street, and we had this crazy idea of maybe in time we could start inviting people over to our place. And we never got that far because there just wasn't enough time to get to know enough people. But during the pandemic, the local Baptist church started a food pantry. And we as a charity shifted all our attention from the food bank to the food pantry. And at my leisure, when I'm ready, I received the good news that I'm not shielding because I got COVID and it was asymptomatic. Therefore, I don't see the need to shield. Because of that, I can go in person to help the local food pantry. So that is imminent, and I can get to know local people.
Excellent. Because
poverty isn't just about not having food, it's about a lack of social mobility, it's about a lack of a certain kind of relationship. And of course, it's a two-way thing. I get to learn an awful lot about people and enrich my own life from meeting people on a wider spectrum. So,
yeah, and I think it's very important for the people who understand and can mix with all sorts of different levels to be able to liaise in some ways. So you were saying that you've kind of worked with some of the incredibly wealthy kind of banks and things like that, and then that enables you to kind of understand and work with everybody, and hopefully find some way of linking up those.
Yes, I mean the what's driving this ethos of nurturing relationships is when we break bread together in church, it's about our relationships with one another as much as our relationship with God. So the second half of 1 Corinthians 11, it's all about the relationship between those who are at the poorer end of the spectrum and those who are slightly more well-to-do. And so as a charity, we just wanted to echo this. We're called Bread of Hope very deliberately. So it's very important for me to be mixing and circulating with people, and shielding was really not helpful.
Yeah, and so why don't we kind of talk briefly about health then?
Okay.
Yeah, you've mentioned shielding, so that was presumably for a fairly serious health condition.
Not a condition, a suspected condition. So in 2013, just after our first son was born, all of, I think, 3 weeks after he was born, I was admitted to hospital with fungal meningitis. And I was in hospital for 5.5 weeks. And the thought process of the hospital was, it's impossible to get fungal meningitis unless there's something wrong with your immune system. So the first thing they did when they admitted me was to test me for HIV. I'm not HIV. So really since then, they've been going down this checklist of what is wrong with John, and they found nothing. I keep acing the tests. So just before the pandemic, I was due the last test. So I think every 5 years, I'm given a pneumococcal vaccine, and that's a benchmark test because a subsequent blood test can then measure the number of antibodies I produce in reaction to the vaccination. But because of the pandemic, outpatients was closed to, well, phlebotomy was closed to outpatients. So I had to wait until last November and had the test, and I aced it. So very frustrating because there was no urgency to do it before the pandemic, but then it became urgent, but it wasn't going to happen. And then that together with catching COVID and being fine is why I'm not shielding. So I think what's going to happen is when I see my consultant in May, I may get discharged, I may not. Either way, I think they're going to say to me, you're healthy, we don't know what happened.
Yeah, because I remember for a while we were kind of talking about where you're at, and you were kind of going through different tests, and you weren't well for kind of quite a while, really, wasn't it? So
yeah, meningitis takes a long time to recover. Now, my mum, who's a retired nurse, was convinced that even if I survived the first night, it was that serious. It wasn't clear I was going to make it. She was convinced that if I did, I'd come out a bit slower than when I went in.
Yeah.
Now, some people would say, well, there you go, but I'm feeling fine.
Yeah. I guess meningitis is one of those conditions that we hear about, but don't necessarily know a huge amount about. So what kind of gave it away, or
what gave it away?
What kind of symptoms?
I didn't recognize my wife.
Okay, that's
so I had a headache. That's the worst headache I've ever had, and it developed very slowly. Now, I did go into A&E, and they shone a light in my eyes. They asked if I had a pain in my neck. These are the two traditional symptoms for meningitis. I was fine. My neck was fine. It was annoying, but it was fine. So they put me on a drip for half an hour, sent me home, and I felt a lot better, but then I deteriorated.
Yeah.
So the point at which I didn't recognize Kathy, so she is American. Her support and her family at that point were largely in the States. She has a three-week-old baby, and I don't know who she is.
Yeah.
I did ask her what the American football score was. So something was going on. I didn't know who she was, but I asked her what the score was of the game the night before. Anyway, she started phoning friends at church, but of course they would have their phones switched off because it was the service on a Sunday morning. Anyway, she managed to get hold of somebody, came round, I went to hospital. And I do remember when I kind of I've got a complete blank of about 24, 48 hours. But my first memories are being in the HDU, the high dependency unit. And I remember being told that the symptoms of fungal meningitis are not the same as viral and bacterial because it's so rare and the symptoms are very muted. So you get the headache, but you don't get a big aversion to light. You don't get really pronounced pains in the neck and shoulders.
So, yeah, that kind of sounds like there wasn't really much to show for it, apart from you suddenly didn't know who Kathy was.
Yeah.
And that's quite a big thing, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, my mum was suspicious, retired nurse.
Yeah.
And she didn't think meningitis was quite right. She thought it might be encephalitis, which was a pretty good guess, actually.
Yeah.
As things turned out.
And how long had you been married at that stage?
That was 2013, so 4 years.
Yeah. And you said that she's American. So how did you meet?
We met in the clubhouse because you meet everybody who's quality in the clubhouse. So Kathy popped into the clubhouse in 2000 and I think it was 2006. And she popped in because she had worked for the same missionary organization as me in the States. She had left in 2000 and I'm saying 2006, it might be 2000. I'm a guy, you know. She'll tell you the day, the exact date. She'd left and she'd moved to Glasgow to work with a church, just to take a year out, to think about what she's going to do with her life. And at the back end of that year, she thought, well, I used to work for this organization. I might as well visit them in London and see what they're up to. And so my boss's boss was too busy to see her. So he phoned me, and I remember him asking if I'd chaperone her and answer her questions. And I remember thinking, I haven't got time for this. I got things to do. I got people to see. And so this is 2007. So we went to the Albany pub, Great Portland Street.
Yeah.
And had a pint. And then we were still talking about mission in an urban setting. So we're talking very much about not just walk, because when people talk about urban mission, they often mean exclusively the disempowered. And we were talking more in terms of workplace ministry, I think. And we were still talking. And so we ended up in the Four Lanterns, which you will know as well, or at least know of.
Okay, yeah.
And then we hung out on the Sunday. I introduced her to church, to All Souls. And there was no initial spark. It was just, we were just very relaxed and easy around each other. And my boss had just left London to return to the US. And he was with his wife due to be at the big mission organization conference that summer. And he said, John, can you just come over and be there with me? I think it was partly to help the re-entry, and it was partly for my benefit to network. And it also happened, and my boss didn't know this, that Kathy was going to drop in to that conference. And that's where things got interesting. And so after the conference, she was in DC, I was in New York. And I changed my ticket home so I could see her in DC. And in a pub in Arlington, I asked, would it make her life more or less complicated if we were to become more than just friends?
Yeah.
And she said, well, I've got nothing to lose. So that, so having crushed my ego, it was fine. So we decided to date with no plan, long distance, London to San Diego. And what that meant was I would get up at 5 a.m. and we'd use Skype. I would be waking up by the time we finished at about 6 or 7, and she'd be falling asleep because of the 8-hour time difference. But we worked out that we could see each other 3 or 4 times a year. I could fly over twice with work. There's always work I could find in the States. And then she would come here once a year, and then I could probably fly once out of my own pocket. So we did that for 2 years. And then we were married in September 2009. And from the time that I arrived to get married until I think the day we got back from honeymoon, I'd spent more time with her than I had in my entire life.
Okay. And you still go out to the States fairly regularly, don't you?
Before the pandemic.
Oh yeah.
It was an annual thing. Because I was shielding last year, Kathy went with Zachary, our youngest, and I stayed back. And I think going forwards with inflation, because of her parents, she will need to go. I may need to make it every other year, maybe every 3 years. So I'm going to have to take a step back, but we're hoping to go this year.
Well, wasn't that kind of a month that you regularly were going out for?
We're planning to go 6 weeks this year. See, Zachary goes into the school system in September. So that will mean that what's that, 6 weeks summer holiday? Well, we need a week to get over jet lag. So it would be no more than 5 weeks. So yes, it'll be a month in future years, for him at least, if not for me.
Okay. Well, now you've mentioned Zachary, let's kind of go on to the subject of children, because I better put out a warning first that this is quite a difficult topic, and so yeah, and it might kind of be difficult for some people. But yes, so you mentioned that you kind of that you got ill after your first, and you mentioned Zachary's your youngest.
Mm.
Do you want to kind of explain as
Yes.
much or as little as
Okay,
you feel
yes,
comfortable?
that's fine. So Daniel was born 3 weeks before I went to hospital in 2013. And I remember lying in hospital thinking, well, at least he's fine and I'm the one who's ill. Fast forward a year, or just over a year, we were out, Kathy and I were out at the Jet Lag Bar, which we mentioned, watching American football. And we get a phone call saying that the babysitter's a little worried about Daniel because he's not sleeping and he's being sick. And we probably ought to go and take a look. And so we left at half time. And Kathy met the babysitter and Daniel at hospital. Or I can't remember, or maybe she did go to the babysitter and pick him up. But anyway, they met at St. Mary's. And the issue was not that just that Daniel was ill, he's 15 months, but he was grey and pretty lethargic. In fact, no, we definitely came home. It's all coming back to me now. We came home after half time and met here. And I remember in this room, you can see the door at the back. We were standing in the doorway and he just pointed at his bed. He just wanted to go to bed. And we were like, he's so lethargic, something's not right.
Yeah.
So I think we'd already been to hospital at that point. Then we came back here, that's right. We went to hospital, met the babysitter, came back here because he was discharged. And we went back and he deteriorated. So there was less than 24 hours from the first symptoms with the babysitter to him passing away at St. Mary's. And the diagnosis was meningitis B. So the first question was, is this some genetic thing that the Horne family has? And the answer is no, because fungal meningitis and bacterial meningitis are two completely different things. And it wasn't long before the meningitis B vaccination, the vaccine I think the government at the time were negotiating a price for it so that it could be a mandatory vaccination. So
I remember now that it was such a short time afterwards that must have really been extra painful, I suppose.
We had to process that. And I think we were also in the middle of an Ebola outbreak in Africa. And I remember just thinking, even if meningitis B was preventable through vaccination, there's always something that isn't. So the way that I consoled myself was, sure, he might have been vaccinated for meningitis B if this had been a year later, but then there's always something else. You can't protect your kids from everything. So, and maybe the other thing to say is, because his death did not involve a person, there's no person responsible, actually that made it easier, I think. I think if your kid's been run over by somebody, or there is an individual who clearly caused harm to your child, that is possibly a lot harder to process. There's a needlessness about it. Why did that person do that? But with the bacteria, it's like, bugs are everywhere. So maybe I'm rationalizing it away a little bit. But we couldn't be in this flat for 3 months after he died. So we stayed with friends up the road in Kensal Rise until and every time we came back to the flat, we had to have someone with us, or we had to have a lot of noise on in the background because we just noticed the quietness. I think the day after he died, that was the hardest, because I woke up in the morning and I had a morning routine with him. And it was just the nothingness that was the hardest.
Yeah, and one thing that was really helpful, I guess, is the amount of support you got seemed to be amazing, and lots of friends and family and everyone kind of.
Yeah, it was amazing. You're right. A combination of email, social media, and a couple of friends who took it upon themselves to pass, to get the word out. So people gave money for the funeral. As a result of that, we were able to buy a family plot in Kensal Green Cemetery. So that means a family plot is like a regular plot. So Daniel isn't in the child and baby section. He's in a section where Kathy and I, God willing, will be buried too.
I remember that. It's right by the river, and
yes,
you said that. He used to love ducks, and
yeah, we were offered two. You're right. We were offered two sites in the cemetery. One nearer the main entrance, off the road, and then another on reclaimed land. And reclaimed land basically means where there had been graves, they've just dumped a bunch of earth on top of it, and it's like a second tier of plots. And the groundsman who was showing this was saying, it's a bit cheaper because people don't really like burying their loved ones on top of other loved ones. And first off, we were like, oh, he'd love it, because the boy was so extroverted and winsome. He just loved people. So there was something fitting about that. And as you know, he loved ducks. And this was by the canal. And the groundsman, without knowing that, told us that the ducklings, there'd be in nests in the trees above this particular part of the cemetery. And their first flight would be from the nest over these graves to the canal. And that, for us, we knew this was the place.
Yeah.
And he loved ducks because if I look past my screen to the window, there's a canal right outside my window. And that canal is the same canal that runs up to the cemetery. So I feel that the water and the canal connect us. Well, it's not just to Daniel, it's to our boys. So, because people had been so generous, we have a friend who's an IVF nurse. We went through IVF and Kathy got pregnant with twins. And so this is the late summer of the same year. And, I was thinking, this is hard. We were in all this counseling. The hospital provided a bereavement counselor who is amazing. And I remember asking her or just sharing my doubt. Like, I really love Daniel. I really miss him. I don't know that my heart has it in it to love like these twins, but you do. Your heart adjusts. It gets bigger. And Kathy's, because we'd lost a child, and because of Kathy's age, I can't remember the exact reasons, but she was deemed high risk. I mean, twins were a risk anyway. And then her waters broke, and they broke just a couple of weeks before babies can survive outside of the womb. We were told that the statistics for this mean this is an extremely rare occurrence, because generally statistics are gathered where there's a comorbidity, where there's some reason for the waters to break. Kathy had no reason. So it's like a bit like lightning, and it struck a second time because meningitis B is rare. And so again, we're in the hospital, and all we need to do is get through 2 weeks, I think it was, without Kathy developing an infection.
Yeah.
And the hospital don't want to administer antibiotics, because if they do and the babies make it, then when Kathy's giving birth, they can't give antibiotics again with any efficacy.
Okay, yeah.
You understand? So long story short, sleepless nights, Kathy in hospital, friends being amazing, and just female friends turning up, friends she hardly knows, or my friends she doesn't know, turning up and just being with her through the night. She goes into labor, and we know that our 2 sons are going to be born without being able to breathe. So by giving birth, they're dying. There is a saving grace in that. If Kathy didn't go into labor and developed an infection, they would have to be aborted for her safety. So there was something natural about them being born, and it was a proper full-on labor. St. Mary's have a dedicated bereavement midwife, and she was brilliant. She just made our children the center of everything. It wasn't like Kathy was left in the side room and her kids weren't going to make it, so would just let her give birth by herself. This was a proper labor, and she gave birth to 2 boys, and we decided on the names ahead of time. And the first to come out, Emmanuel, God with us. If you remember the Gospel of John, when Jesus wept because Lazarus had died, wept is a euphemism. It's more like it's a defiant act of weeping. It's an anger at death, and we thought that Emmanuel captured something of that. Well, we had decided beforehand not to give any of our kids biblical names, and 3 of the 4 of them have biblical names, so we failed. And then we named the second twin Reginald after my grandfather. And it turned out that Emmanuel looked like Kathy, and Reginald, named after my grandfather, looked like me. And the hospital gave us, I think, the night and some of the morning just to be with them in a side room. So we had them with us to say goodbye, and they were buried in the same plot as Daniel. So, that's not a good year, 2015.
No. And how did you kind of process all of that?
Somebody, this is, I don't know at the time how we did, but somebody, this may have been the following year, came to us and said we were causing them a headache because they were wrestling with suffering and God. And there we were, having gone through all of this suffering, looking like we were bearing up more or less. So I remember we sat in the basement of Itsu on Regent Street, on Upper Regent Street. And I didn't know what to say to her. I really didn't. And then I had this thought. And the thought was, we know in our heads that grace is amazing, like it's a conceptual thing. And so I said to her, I think what's happening is we're experiencing grace. Okay. And I said it like I'd never, like this was a new thing, like I was saying it for the first time. Like it wasn't obvious. Grace isn't obvious. In our gospel presentations, oh yeah, grace, yeah, it's unconditional. But when you're in it, it is really not obvious. And so the cogs were worried. Oh, I think this is grace. And this is the conceptual bit. When there is suffering, it doesn't so much question God's power or his goodness. The faithfulness to God that grace produces is evidence of God's power and goodness. It is far harder. It is a miracle to keep walking when everything has been stripped away. And in a way, we are the apologetic. So that's how we processed it. I guess into, I mean, there's still not, it's not like a knockdown apologetic argument. So that's how we processed that in our heads. And then I wrote a book, Dreaming of Daniel. More thoughts in there. It's on Amazon, self-published. But emotionally, what helped was getting into bereavement counseling quickly. And we were learning to integrate the loss with our life. Because if you spend all your time in the loss, the danger is pathological grieving. You just disappear into a black hole. If you spend all of your time in everyday life, you end up in denial. So how can you integrate the loss with life? And it's a process of, for us, it was largely consisted of visiting the plot every week and just talking to our boys. And before we left, we'd tell them that we love them and to sleep well.
Yeah. And so, yeah, things like bereavement counselling were kind of really key to kind of helping.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so if somebody else is going through that kind of thing, then you'd recommend.
Yeah, and we didn't go in because we thought we'd be really bad at grieving or that grieving was a weakness. I've always viewed counselling as personal development. It's something positive. It's not something that you do when something goes wrong, so much as something that you do, like going to the gym, so that you can be in something like a marathon for the long haul.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things that, you know, I've had counselling at different points, and it does seem the kind of thing that I would recommend to most people, and just because there is so much, you know, self-learning that's available through it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I feel for counsellors. They can't earn a living from it, and I feel for people who want to be in counselling, because so often it's so expensive because counsellors need to make a living. But it is a wonderful, wonderful thing. You should go to counselling even if you don't need counselling, even if there's no presenting crisis in your life. It's just
Definitely,
a very,
yeah.
very good thing to do.
Yeah, and a lot of the times when kind of work or wherever kind of, you know, the doctors kind of give counselling, it's usually only kind of, I think, 6 sessions now, which doesn't really seem to give you the chance to get anywhere with it.
No, I imagine that part of the rationale is if you do 6 weeks, you're able to take some of the things that you've learned and self-counsel.
Yeah, I think it's getting through the crisis rather than actually getting deeper with it.
Yes. Yeah.
Hey, didn't you study counselling for a bit?
I did. So the backdrop is, I was thinking about doing a doctorate in theology. So to go even further back, I studied theology, did a master's in theology, and then worked with UCCF with theological students. And then I worked for 3 years in academic book publishing. So I've got a background in theology, and it seems self-evident that one day I would do a doctorate. But to do it with my then employer required me to do it in the States. And that's time consuming. There's much more work that needs to be done just to apply. And so the place where I ended up applying didn't take any students that year. And I'm like, well, what am I going to do? And so I did counselling instead. I did that at Birkbeck. I did a certificate in counselling, which is the foundation if I ever want to go do the full thing, which is on it's on my mind. Although maybe we'll wait out inflation before paying for the rest of my counselling training.
Yeah.
Best thing I did before I got married, by the way.
Okay.
Very, very helpful. Very helpful.
Yeah. And so you've mentioned kind of the horrific time kind of, you know, with 3 children there, but you've now got another one, haven't you?
Yes. And this is another amazing story. So basically we did another round of IVF, but we never got all the way through it because, or maybe we did, and it just didn't produce anything. And it just turned out we were too old. We'd passed that threshold. So I think we had one embryo frozen from the time we had the twins. It was something like this old embryo. And so the question for us was, how do we get rid of it? Because, you know, we're done. So I said to Kathy, well, maybe the most humane thing to do is dispose of it by putting it in her.
Okay.
And that's what we did. Like, we were getting rid of an embryo rather than, it just felt wrong just to stop paying the clinic to keep it on ice.
Yeah.
They'd just destroy it. So we thought, well, we'll get rid of him or her by putting the embryo into Kathy.
Yeah.
And then she got pregnant. And then we got through the pregnancy, and because we'd had losses, we weren't ready to announce the pregnancy. It's like we weren't afraid of what might happen so much as other people. When you have had loss, other people can just say weird stuff. So after we lost Daniel, someone said to us, well, now God's really going to bless you. We were like, well, why? It's not like we've earned anything. It doesn't owe us anything. And then when our twins died, it's kind of awkward with that person. So to make it easy for everybody, we decided not to announce it. So we're on the church holiday. Kathy is something like 20 weeks pregnant, and we're trying to hide it. And my brother, bless him, says, why don't you just walk around with a Krispy Kreme donuts bag? So people were like looking at Kathy, looking at us, and we were trying to be deadpan. Nothing going on. Anyway, we probably announced, so it was well into the second trimester when we announced Zachary. And he's fine. He's lovely. You can see his cot. It's not really a cot. He's 4. It's a junior bed behind me where he sleeps.
Yeah. And yeah, and I suppose he's very lively now, and
yes,
yeah.
And we're not getting any younger. He makes us feel it.
And so I guess he's starting school in the summer, isn't he?
Yeah, in September. So this is our last long stint in the States. It'll be our last long one before he starts school.
Yeah.
I tell you what, I never appreciated how difficult half terms and holidays were. Both our employees are quite good in that we can work flexi time. And I arranged a dinner lady contract. So yeah, I founded a charity, but there's a board to whom I report. And so we worked out what we call a dinner. I don't know what a teacher's contract looks like. So we called it a dinner lady's contract, in that I work more hours in term time and less hours in holidays. And we just look at the council's breakup of term time vis-a-vis holiday, and work out my wage so that it's paid. It works out the same every month, but within that I can be somewhat flexible as long as I hit my target for a term time or a holiday. But it's during the pandemic, when we were locked down, I think both of us wanted to be in the bedroom working and not having to play with Zachary. He's lovely, but it's a lot. It's a lot. And I suddenly, my parents, I appreciate them a lot more.
Yeah. And I suppose that's one of those things that a lot of people must have experienced during the pandemic, because they were kind of homeschooling or just closed for a while, but especially difficult for those like you who were shielding for all of it.
Yeah, that was very difficult. We delayed his entry to nursery by half a term because it was this time last year. The number of cases was spiking, and it was Delta. And so a friend of ours sadly had passed away at Christmas, who was also shielding, and we postponed his start to nursery for half a term. And this is the thing, we live in a 1-bedroom flat, we're missionaries, this is the way it is. It's not unusual for big cities. And you can't shield from one another. Like if Kathy, while I was shielding, if Kathy came into contact with somebody who had COVID, or they had been in contact with someone who had COVID, I'm supposed to limit my contact with her, i.e. shield. It's like, well, and I think that's why there was a, at the beginning of the pandemic, all the way through it, there was an open letter from 100+ medics around the world saying, we need to get on with this without restrictions. There's other ways of handling this. We just need to protect the most vulnerable. And all of that's great, but in practice, you cannot. And that is why we needed the restrictions to be in place, because the poor, we're not poor, but there are people living, if you've got 3, 4, 5 people in a 1-bedroom flat, you cannot shield, you cannot protect the vulnerable. And that is why everyone needs to shield.
Yeah, with my parents, my dad was had shield, but mum was told that she just had to kind of keep contact at a minimum, and they just said, well, that's impractical. We live in it's a good sized house, but spending a couple of years barely seeing each other was just impractical. So they both went into shielding, but.
And that's it. Everyone needs to shield. So Kathy was essentially shielding.
Yeah.
And it's not sustainable. So it as much as I sympathize with that open letter or that open statement, it's not practical. It's you can't just, it's a nice idea that everyone who's vulnerable is able to shield, but the truth of our world is, because of inequality, we cannot.
And you went right the way through without kind of getting COVID, didn't you? And then it's only very recently.
So Kathy caught it. We were fairly sure it either came from the local Baptist church or our own Anglican church, because those are the only places she'd been. So by the time we processed what it might look like for me to limit my contact in our very small flat, I had caught COVID. And I wouldn't have known because I was asymptomatic. And so that night I did not sleep, because this was very good news. And the next day I tested positive, and I couldn't sleep that night either. I'm like, wow, this changes my life. All the people to catch up with, the way my work looks will change. It just seemed like a lot of possibilities. And I only had symptoms on days 3, 4, and 5, and I sneezed a lot, like an abnormally high number of sneezes. That was it. Kathy had more flu-like symptoms. And then we were desperate for Zachary to catch it. This was during his half term, and we're like, oh, we've had him at home for a week. We can't have him at home for 2 weeks. But we did, because he caught it kind of a week after we did. And he just had a snotty nose. But it was hard. The week that Kathy and I had it, but Zachary did not, 3 different friends came over to take Zachary out, which was nice. And when he had it, but we were recovering, we were also just locked in with him. But it was fine. So I'm not shielding while Omicron's dominant. I think it might be a different story with a different variant, but.
And I noticed that you put something on Facebook kind of on your first day out after kind of, 2 years effectively.
We celebrated, we went to a Lebanese place in Paddington, the first eatery I had been in 2 years. And then just this Saturday gone, I went on a bus for the first time in 2 years, and Zachary was ecstatic that his daddy was going on a bus.
And that must be really strange for him as well, because he's for half of his life he's not known you to be going out much.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even I'm still processing it. I just helped Kathy take the laundry to the laundrette,
Yeah.
and we got to the door. She went in, and I stood there, and it took a few seconds to realize, oh no, I can go in as well. Like it's not going to kill me.
Yeah. So that now you're kind of able to go out. Are there kind of a few things that what kind of aims do you really have for the year to
On
get out
Saturday, I went into Soho. Bread of Hope on the side supports a charity that works with punks and goths and metalheads. And I went with them into the basement of Garlic and Shots to help with their club night. And I DJ'd for them for 2.25 hours. And I had a bottle of beer. It was my first time in the inside of a pub. I'd been to a beer garden a couple of times, but my first time on the inside, in the inside of a pub in 2 years. And I DJ'd. So the way it works is this: all the music, at least the main singer-songwriter, there's evidence of a journey with Jesus somewhere. And people come in and they're like, oh, I'm not familiar with this. I mean, sometimes they are. There's bands like Wasp, Megadeth, people have heard of them. May not know that people have become Christians in the bands, but they've heard of them. But most of the stuff I play, they're like, oh, that's good, but I can't place it. And we just say, we're Christians. All this music you're hearing, the main singer-songwriter at least is a Christian. And that's all it takes to start a conversation about Jesus. And that has been a formula that Asylum have used for 30 years.
And that's something that you've been kind of passionate about and regular, kind of there for many years, haven't you?
Yes, because it's a scene where you can talk about this stuff. It's like an in-your-face scene, so you can talk about this stuff kind of out there in your face.
And also, you love music, don't you?
I do. I don't like all the music, and I've had to learn genres that I don't resonate with me, but I've had to learn to attune my ear to what's good and what isn't good. I spent a lot of the pandemic. I spent a lot of Zachary's early life listening to stuff because it's 3 a.m. I've got him. What else are you going to do?
Yeah.
And so I've been curating things for a long time. And you're right. I've been involved with this ministry since 1992. Wow. And the beauty of setting up your own charity is, well, it was part of the rationale. We could respond very quickly to local needs. So with a big organization, John, you do workplace ministry, you don't do punks and goths, so that is your own thing. It's not, but when you have your own charity, I mean, again, I'm not a director, I'm not a trustee, so I don't own it really. They do, I guess. But we're able to respond to local needs very quickly. So if I look at my life and all the opportunities to bless people, well, I know punks and goths, I know a lot of rich people, well, middle class, upper middle class people. And I'm living amongst people who sometimes struggle to make ends meet. Well, we can work out ways of blessing everybody.
Yeah. Does that mean that Zachary loves his metal?
He when he was very little, a couple of months old, he would fall asleep to a particular band who are not so heavy, it's just noise, and not so melodic, it's pop. But there was like this midpoint, and it would get him to sleep. They go melodic noise.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he's a little young still, but there's time. One of my friends bought him an Iron Maiden onesie when he was very small, and we'll see. He'll probably end up liking drum and bass and stuff. We'll send him to you, Steve.
Oh, I hope so, yeah. And we're nearly kind of at the end of this, so just very quickly, kind of films. We haven't talked about films.
Yes, horror films.
Yeah, are you still kind of watching lots of them?
Yes, I have been liaising with Peter Laws. Peter Laws, Laws, is a Baptist minister who also writes for Fortean Times. The Fortean Times is a publication that covers the paranormal. He writes a column for it. He's also written a book called Frighteners on horror. And I'm just name dropping that now, because if there's not time to explain everything about horror and Jesus, horror and the Christian faith, people can go and read Peter Laws's stuff.
Okay.
But basically, I don't think we're very good at lament in the church. So when Daniel died, we wanted everyone to read Psalm 88 together. It ends, "The darkness is my closest friend." And the minister, Dan Wells, bless him, the minister at the time, just said, I just need to go away and think how this will work. I need to think and reflect on whether the congregation are ready to read Psalm 88. So I'm just saying that lament and horror aren't too far apart. And what he did in the service was Daniel's coffin came in and he said, we're going to read Psalm 88 together. It's okay to read it because it's in the Bible. But the fact that he needed to give permission for people to read words of lament is because church too often is escapism. We use the time of singing as an escape rather than a means of expressing what's going on inside of us or in our culture. We live in a very sanitized culture. Well, up until the war starting, you could make a case for that.
And just for context, if people are watching this at other points, we talk about Ukraine,
yes,
which has been going on for a couple of weeks now. So,
and it's a good thing that it's since the Second World War we haven't seen anything like that, at least outside of the Balkans on this continent. But it just shows that we're not used to horror. And what does horror do? What does it fun? Because obviously it's not in the Bible in the sense that you won't find the plot line to, I don't know, Friday the 13th in the Bible. It gives us a way of articulating horror. It gives us a language for evil. And like any good art, if it can also evoke empathy, then it's helping us to become more human, more like Jesus. So those are the kind of things you'd want to say about why horror is important. But it's also important to say not all horror films are equal. Some are rubbish. Some are just mindless gore. Sometimes they're mindless gore and they're funny, so that's not a bad thing. But you have to take each film on its artistic merits. But where it's saying something important, it's teaching us how to talk about difficult things. We read Psalm 88 together because we live in a sanitized church, a sanitized culture. We're not always good at putting words to horror. And both the Psalms of Lament and horror films, if curated wisely, can be helpful.
Yeah, so it's learning to kind of, I suppose, discuss and feel open to kind of talking about the real difficulties and some of the awful things that go on in the world, isn't it? And learning how to recognize those emotions and process them. And
yes,
it's okay to feel horrible sometimes.
Yes, I think horror, and for Peter Laws, horror films, he realized, were a parallel journey, or perhaps the same journey as his coming to faith. He was searching for spirituality. And the horror films help because they are dealing with spirituality.
Yeah, and just in this discussion, you've kind of talked about some of the really horrible things that you've had to go through, and those really dark periods. And
it's far worse than horror films.
Yeah.
So people may have an issue with horror films. Real life, as Ukraine is telling us, is far worse. So after our twins died, I went back to reading horror. And I think the best written horror stories are ghost stories. So I remember reading The Woman in Black. I'd never read the novel. And the ghost, the woman in black, is haunting people because her child died. After really losing 3 kids, I just thought she needed a good slap to get over it, and she wasn't grieving very well.
Yeah.
But for a period after losing our kids, I was kind of invincible, completely inoculated to anything scaring me or making me jump. But the flip side to it might be perhaps one of the ways we were able to articulate the horror of losing kids and to be comfortable within our own skins was, at least at my end, I can't vouch for Kathy, at least at my end, horror may have helped.
Yeah, I remember that we spent many hours kind of talking about horror. Yeah, that was before your kids. So yeah, I can't imagine how much that must have affected him. Yeah.
That's right. And I think I did mention to you that Peter Laws does the Community Cove podcast. I think I did send you a link.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, well, Peter Laws is the brains behind it. And he is actually really a Baptist minister. And his book, The Frighteners, I've just mentioned it. It'll explain why being a Christian and having a love for horror are in no way mutually incompatible.
Okay, and I know that Zachary's due back any minute, so I suppose we probably should.
The background noise is about to go through the ceiling.
Yeah, so yeah, I have to say a massive thank you. I know that you've talked about some really difficult issues, and it's been really interesting to hear from you. And just before we do kind of wind up, if people have experienced any of that kind of stuff, or do need help in working out how to process bereavement and things like that, what kind of resources are available?
Any friend who listens, any friend who can help you to articulate yourself. I think it comes down to relationships. People who don't talk and don't try and fix it for you, or say, well, at least this, or time will pass, or none of those things are helpful. Just somebody who will listen to the point of helping you to draw out of yourself what you need to say and process.
And I suppose things like, I don't really understand, but I'm here for you. And
yes,
anything
it's being present. Being present with people.
Yeah.
And these are counseling skills, but you don't need to be a counselor. In fact, some of the best people or some of the best practitioners of these things aren't counselors at all. They're just good human beings. Find people who listen.
Yeah, and one of the big things I think that the pandemic's taught us is the value of kind of friends and family, and just being in touch with other people. And
Definitely.
That's one of the big reasons why I've kind of started doing this, because there's people like you that I've known for years, but we kind of lost touch with it, and so it's really nice just to spend time chatting to you.
It's shocking because you don't live too far away.
No. And so having to kind of start a YouTube channel to chat to people is that shows how difficult I suppose life is sometimes. And
yes,
I'm hoping that I'll reconnect with people and then stay in touch a bit better. So I have to say thank you so much for coming here, talking about everything, just letting us know more about your life.
Anytime. Thank you for bearing with me. It's taken us 6 months to get round to this. Kept putting it back, and here we are. Finally.
Yeah, and there's so many different things that kind of kept coming up, but it's great to finally have you here. And so thank you, Jon. It's been amazing. I'm Steve. This is Chatting with Interesting People.